The Waco History Podcast is sponsored by Brotherwell Brewery on Historic Bridge Street in Waco.
Cross the Brazos and Waco, ride hard and I'll make it by dawn. Cross the Brazos and Waco, I'm safe when I reach San Antonio.
All right, well, welcome back to the Waco History Podcast, and I've been getting lonely since Randy has left, and so I brought in a guest host with me for today's episode. So I want to welcome Eric Ames back, who is not a stranger to the program. He's one of our repeat offenders at the Waco History Podcast. Eric works for the University Library Systems with me, but he is also a lecturer in the Museum Studies Department and has a degree in Public Relations and Museum Studies, and so a varied background. But he is an author, as our listeners know, of now at least three, I haven't checked with him lately.
Just three.
At least three books on Waco history. And so how is Hidden History of Waco doing?
It's doing well.
Good.
Yeah, I've been excited to find it show up in more and more retail spots. The other day I walked past a rotator at HEB and saw my book title staring back at me and thought, this is it. I've made it. We've arrived.
Fantastic. So
Yeah.
if you're listening at HEB and you are in the 15 items or less aisle and you have 15 items, grab Eric's books, move over to the next aisle, and check it out. I think you'll enjoy reading it. And so I've asked Eric here to guest host, and this is an episode I've been looking forward to doing for a while, because another mutual friend of Eric and I's is Clint Lynch. And Clint is a local here from Waco, went off other places, a trained historian, and so he has a history background. But you may know him here in Waco if you run into him in recent years. You've been back about 5 years?
5 years, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So Clint is the general manager of the Oakwood Cemetery Association.
Yes.
And I want to say that right. And I know it's bigger than Oakwood, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But Oakwood is a landmark, a longtime landmark of Waco. And so I thought it'd be good for us to visit a little bit about Oakwood. Maybe Mike Hamilton, who does our production here, can add some music here that sets the tone for a discussion of Oakwood Cemetery. And so, Clint, I'd love to start out just because we've got a lot of folks that listen that are new to Waco and may be wondering what I'm talking about, which is hard to believe for folks that are longtime Wacoans. But if you'll talk just a little bit about some of the general history of Oakwood, the who and when, and those sorts of questions.
Sure. Oakwood is actually the fourth oldest cemetery in Waco. A lot of people think it's a lot older than it is, but when the First Street Cemetery filled up, that's when Oakwood came into being. The first burial was, I believe, October 21st, 1878. Prior to it being a cemetery, it was a fairground and a racetrack. It was out of town, kind of far away, and so as most cemeteries, start out to be. But after the very first burial was Rose Parrott. She was 3 years old when she passed away, and she's part of the old Waco family, the Parrott family. And so from there, the cemetery just kind of sprang into being, and more people started using it because there was no real burial place in town. And so then they started moving their loved ones from First Street Cemetery, as First Street was kind of falling into disrepair.
Mm-hmm.
But Oakwood was started by the city of Waco. It was a city cemetery for about 20 years until the city secretary stole all of Oakwood's money. And then that's when the city fathers gave it to their wives to manage and operate. And so that is how it's become to be the Oakwood Cemetery Association. And since 1898, there's only been women on the board of directors.
Is that in the organizing documents for it, or?
It is not. We cannot find it anywhere. And I think it makes us special, but there may be some men show up on the board one of these days.
Okay, well, there's a glass ceiling there that needs to be broken.
That's
well, that's great though. So the First Street Cemetery, which Eric's talked about a little bit in his podcast, and of course Helen Marie Taylor talked about. She was involved in some of those restoration efforts down there. Kind of remind us where that was or is.
First Street Cemetery is right on the access road to Interstate 35 and University Parks Drive. A lot of people think it's associated with the Texas Ranger Hall of Fame because it happens to be a neighbor, but it's right there on the river.
Okay.
Yes.
And so you said there were two others besides that
yes.
one. Yeah.
Hebrew Rest, which is right behind First Street, is the second oldest. And then Greenwood Cemetery on the other side of the river is actually 3 years older than Oakwood.
Okay. Interesting. I think there's a lot of interesting comparatives between Greenwood's development and Oakwood's
Yes.
development because they're both such long-standing cemeteries in town.
Exactly.
Yeah, Eric talked about, and I mainly brought you here, Eric, so you can say his name.
You want me to say the full name of
Yeah.
Albertus Telephus Johnson, which that's not the full name. That's his short name, Uncle Tell. Clint is reaching for a brochure because I'm certain he's going to talk about this from his perspective. Yes, we talked about the relocation of this storied individual from First Street to Oakwood, and I didn't write the name down. I should have known that you would ambush me with that. Thankfully, we will find that, and we can edit this pause out.
I just imagined in your sleep that name came to you because you rattled it off so well.
It's my personal mantra. I say it every morning in the mirror to remind myself I am good enough, and I might get relocated to Oakwood someday if I'm lucky.
Now, are you talking about Telephus, Telemachus, Louis, Augustus, Albertus, Johnson?
That's the guy.
The one and only?
TTAAL, as
Yes.
his friends call him.
So, but as you talked about it, Clint, so he's part of a larger movement to relocate
Yes.
graves. And do you know why they're doing that? I mean, just because of the state of...
I think it probably was a lot to do with the state of the cemetery.
Mhm.
Those that drive by First Street, his mausoleum is still standing. There was an article in the paper about a month ago about they kind of restored it a little bit. But, they moved him to Oakwood. And I can't say exactly when that happened.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm sure there was some fanfare because he was such a fantastical figure in history.
Yeah, I think it's in Eric's book. So
Yes.
again, if you're at HEB, get Eric, get Eric's book, and you'll have that reference.
Thank you, Stephen. We should disclose at this point that I've hired him to pitch my book literally everywhere he goes. He's my hype man, and I really appreciate that.
Yeah, because Oakwood would have been way out there. I mean, if we think about 1878.
Oh, yeah,
I mean,
definitely.
that would have been out in the boonies. And what do you know? I know you've been a funeral director as well, different places. Do you know much about kind of funerary practices like during this period?
Yeah, I did. I know a little bit.
Yeah.
After the Civil War was when embalming really came into practice. And so you had people moving around the country able to, not having to bury, immediately like they used to. So you've got people, and some of the old records coming in from Dallas, Houston, out of state, just wanting to come home. So you've got a lot of that. What's really fascinating is a lot of the iconography that shows up on the headstones themselves and what they represent. And there's always something new that I'm discovering, just walking around the cemetery.
Well, you can't say that without giving me some examples of stuff that's maybe your favorite iconography.
There's one where there's a hand pointing up. There's others where there's hands shaking hands. There's beautiful obelisks that are out there that have an urn at the top of them, and that urn is covered. And so, there's all sorts of different things that are out there.
Some of my favorites are the ones with the torches that are upside down to represent that they've been extinguished.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of really great carvings and iconography and just beautiful imagery at Oakwood.
Oh yeah. The heartbreaking ones are the little lambs that sit on top of the kids.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Just appropriate pause.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is tough. The hands, as far as the meaning of some of that, do you have a sense of what the meaning of some of that is?
Of course, the one pointing up is they're going to heaven.
Okay, I've seen that after touchdowns where they do that. So now I get that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
What about the hands touching each other?
The hands, they're kind of like shaking hands. I'm not sure if that's kind of like a meeting with God or something along those lines.
Okay. to go back and kind of trace the history, it seemed like Oakwood very quickly became the place to be if you were newly dead.
Yes.
Because I mean the who's who of the recently dead are populating Oakwood, and talk a little bit about some of those figures.
Oh gosh, I mean, you can't. The best place to learn Waco history is to walk through Oakwood. It is a representation of the town. You've got, of course, Mr. Johnson that's out there.
Let's refer to him as Mr. Johnson.
Exactly, because I'm not going to say that whole name again. You've got William Cameron. You've got William Kelper Brand. You've got George Erath. You've got the Ross family. There wouldn't be a Waco without the Ross family and George Erath. So, I mean, there's just every aspect of Texas history and Waco history is represented on the grounds.
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to find some bunches of information so that I could speak somewhat intelligently today. And, it's kind of a Encyclopedia Britannica of just who's who, of just people. It's amazing.
Yeah, and Waco history, but Texas history.
Exactly.
In the 19th century, definitely.
Yeah. 3 governors of Texas, lieutenant governor of Texas, congressmen, state representatives, they're all out there.
For $500, who are the 3 governors buried in Oakwood Cemetery?
Is he good for it?
Sure.
It's Bitcoin.
It's Bitcoin.
It's Dogecoin.
Okay,
Yeah,
there
yeah.
you go. You've got Richard Koch, Lawrence Sullivan Ross, and of course Pat Neff.
Yep, that's right.
Pay up.
Yeah.
Man knows his deceased governors.
Not immediately.
You're gonna have to send him a crypto wallet.
Exactly.
A encrypted link.
Yeah.
Well, one of the words you mentioned as we get into people, is the grounds, the layout itself. So something I've always been curious about is, do you have any sense how the overall movement towards sort of the beautification of cemetery spaces developed over the 19th century? You saw Frederick Law Olmsted working in these places where they became not just a place to put the deceased, but a place to come and celebrate a life lived. You saw people having picnics in cemeteries. You saw it being a real place for people to come and gather. Do you know if there was any influence from that movement on the creation of Oakwood, or was it really a function of, we have the space, we know we can use it this way?
I think Oakwood has kind of been, has just kind of grown and come into its own. I was reading in one of the history books that I've got in my office today, is that when they first took it over, there was no trees out there.
Mm-hmm.
And so, they were planting trees right and left. What Oakwood is really known for is its main avenue of all those stately live oak trees. And those are all about 100 years old now. And so they were all dedicated to certain individuals in memoriam. But I've got some great pictures that one of the former board members dropped off at my office that I had never seen before. There's some Gildersleeve photos. And the families themselves would spend a lot of money and a lot of time, beautifying their grave spaces. Beautiful topiaries and shrubbery and trees and flowers, all sorts of stuff that they could do just to make it a pleasant place to go, because the cemetery was, like you talked about in the old days, they would go out and decorate and keep the graves clean, and they would picnic, and that was their connection to to their past and to their families.
I would imagine relocating some of these early families, Oakwood gave them an opportunity to kind of do a do-over. I mean, from a frontier grave, which I would imagine would be fairly modest, to something a little more impressive.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
In the night, I think it was 1959, maybe a little earlier. Neil McClendon was moved to Oakwood. His cemetery where he was is now under Lake Waco. And so they've got a beautiful monument there for him, a 1936 centennial marker. They moved quite a few of his family members. And there's some other people that were moved along with him that are in close proximity. So, it gives them that opportunity to recognize and memorialize those figures that are, long since passed.
You mentioned the Brand grave, which I know folks have interacted with over, I don't know if life's the appropriate term, but over the life of the grave.
Yes.
Can you, we have a episode telling who Brand is, but maybe just a little bit of his story and maybe how he's kind of continued to be this figure in town.
This lightning rod.
Yeah.
William Brand was, a journalist, I guess you could call him. He was very strong in his opinions. I guess that's a safe assumption.
Yeah.
But his opinions didn't always align with everything that Waco stood for. Didn't much care for Baptists, didn't much care for Episcopalians, didn't much care for women and African Americans. And he printed it, didn't mind what was said. And because of that, he was kidnapped by a bunch of Baylor students at one point, tried to get him to retract his comments. I'm not sure how that worked out for either party. And then he got into a war of words with the county judge at that time, George Gerald, I believe was his name, and ended up in a gunfight in the middle of downtown Waco, where Judge Gerald lost his arm, and the guy that actually shot and killed him died, and Brand pulled his own pistol and shot and killed his assailant. And word is that his assailant is also buried at Oakwood as well. So, but Brand, was buried at Oakwood, had a beautiful monument. There was a piece at the top that's called the Urn of Knowledge. Unfortunately, it has since disappeared. It disappeared in about 2009. But then there is all that's left is a little small pedestal with his silhouette on it. And there is, if you look closely enough, right at the temple of the silhouette, there's a little pockmark where even in death, somebody shot him.
Took a shot at him.
Yes.
Yeah, I think Randy deemed Brand Waco's first troll.
Yes.
And so people still have strong feelings.
Exactly.
Against Brand, besmirching. I think it was the character of the Baylor women that Brand besmirched that really offended the people at Baylor.
I know he went after Rufus Burleson pretty severely, and eventually caused his resignation.
Who is also buried in Oakwood Cemetery.
Yes.
Yeah.
The great thing about Oakwood is I've been wanting for years to try to do different tours of the cemetery. You can do a political tour. You can do a Waco tour, the old Waco families. You could do a Baylor tour. There's just so many different aspects that you can track out there. And they're all, the neat thing is, and there's always been that joke is, in Waco, you have to be careful who you're talking about because, everybody knows everybody and everybody's related to everybody. But, everybody in Waco's history is such a small, tight-knit community that, Rufus Burleson, who baptized Sam Houston, and he knew Shapley Ross, Lawrence Sullivan Ross's dad, and he looked at L.S. Ross and said, that boy's going to be governor one day. And he lived long enough to see it.
Wow.
So there's some amazing stories that are out there that are like that.
You're talking about everyone in Waco knows everyone, and you got to be careful what you say. That reminds me that Madison Cooper Jr. is also buried at Oakwood. And of course, he wrote Saronia, Texas, which was supposed to be this Romana Clef sort of veiled allegory for Waco from Reconstruction to World War I. But it's a beautiful marker. The Cooper family marker is a milestone within that setting. So anytime I bring people to town, they say, oh, take me to the historic cemetery. That's one of the stops along the way. What are some other sort of must-see markers or stones or monuments if you were to come out and tour Oakwood for the first time?
They're all clustered together. You've got William Cameron's headstone. It's a beautiful piece. We're actually trying to get it cleaned up and preserved a little bit. Right across the street from him is J.W. Mann, who's was the brick maker whose bricks built the suspension bridge. Just these great monuments unto themselves.
So is Cameron over on the right? So let's say we're driving through the gate right now and listening to this. Is Cameron over on the right?
Cameron is on the right in the very first block, and then just immediately across the street from him, on that same right side, is J.W. Mann. Right behind J.W. Mann is Shapley Ross and the Ross family, Lawrence Sullivan Ross, his sister Kate Ross, who, I think her claim to fame is she was the first Anglo child born in Waco. So in that first block 1, is where, the who's who are buried of those early figures. You've got Richard Koch, who's the first governor that was and United States senator that was buried at Oakwood. His wife was one of the first board members after it became a foundation, and or an association. And his monument is built. It's got a sculpture of him on the top, and he's facing his best friend, Dr. Wallace. And when Coke came to Waco, he lived with Wallace, and he appointed him head of the state hospital when he was governor of Texas.
Mm-hmm.
And Wallace was an early figure in psychiatry. And they've got these two beautiful sculptures, and they're just facing each other.
Mm.
When I first came to Waco, I was told, well, they hated each other. They didn't want to turn their backs on each other. The story was not true. And that's the biggest problem with Oakwood is you get all these stories that are not true. So, but those are, walking around that first block, you really just get a sense of, the architecture of the stones that are there and kind of the personalities of some of the individuals.
Is it wrong to think of kind of that front part as the beginning and kind of the frontier as you move back, like it develops? Does it develop? It's about a 2-block width, right?
There's 4 blocks across the front.
Across the
Yes,
front,
sir.
okay. And so kind of the earliest graves are across the front and it develops back.
Yeah, well, it's kind of hard to say because they jump around.
Mm.
And, the blocks are, the way that they're laid out, when I first got there, I was trying to kind of, figure out, which block is which. And my first question was, well, who got liquored up and laid this place out? But over time, you find that, as they added property, they would add more blocks. And so they're not in sequential order.
Okay.
Yeah. But you're along the right. The old section is where the cemetery really took off, and the cemetery is divided into 2 sections. There's the old section, which is the actual square blocks, and then in 1928, Oakwood bought the cemetery behind it, which was Park Lawn Cemetery, and so we just tore the fence down, and then the first burial was in that same year for Oakwood personnel to bury somebody. And so Park Lawn was actually started by F.M. Compton, which had the funeral homes in town, which now is Conley Compton Funeral Home.
Okay. And how old was that cemetery? Yeah.
I don't know a lot about it.
Okay.
It had been around for quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
Oakwood is a nonprofit cemetery. It's always been set up as a nonprofit. And Park Lawn was a for-profit, and it just wasn't able to make it.
Okay. The original cemetery, I think I read 157 acres now. Is
165 is kind of where we've kind of landed.
So how big? Do you know how big that original cemetery was at the?
It was probably about 40, 45, 50 acres maybe. Yeah.
Okay. So when they acquired that, they needed the space at that point to continue to expand.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and they really didn't want a derelict cemetery behind them.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's when they came in and took it over.
So that leads to the question then, how are you set for expansion moving into the future?
You looking, get in the market, Eric?
I mean, we're all mortal, Stephen.
Yeah,
We're all going to pass off the mortal coil.
Well, and if you need property, let me know. I'll be more than happy to help you out.
That's actually what this is all about.
That's right. Exactly.
Our sponsor this week, Oakwood
That's
Cemetery
right.
Association.
That's right. What we have is we're about half full. There's enough room for about 75,000 burials, and we're 38,000 and some change.
Okay.
I don't know why I'm thinking about this, but is a plot about the same size, like a modern plot? A cemetery plot about the same size as they're plotting cemetery plots?
Mm-hmm. Our average space is about 4 foot wide. In the older sections, they're a little bit longer than they are in the back sections. And that's just because of, the headstones back then were bigger. People were able to actually spend a little bit more money and develop something a little bit larger. Nowadays, in the back sections, they're 4x8, 4x10.
So people were smaller back then because that's what they tell you on every historic house tour, but their cemetery plots were larger.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I love this.
Exactly.
Has 6 feet always been the standard?
It's not really 6 foot.
Okay. See?
It depends on what kind of container you're in. State law now is you've got to have anywhere from 18 to 24 inches of coverage between the top of the casket and the top of the ground.
Oh, that's it.
That's it.
Oh, man. Well, a little wasted labor if you're digging 6 feet down.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You mentioned earlier, of course, one of the things that keeps kind of Oakwood in conversations is the wrong stuff. The folklore or the
Right.
stories that get shared, not to perpetuate them, but to destroy them. Tell them now.
Every last one of them.
Yeah.
The biggest one that I know of right off the top of my head is the one about Richard Koch and Dr. Wallace, that they hated each other. So, that's the one that comes to mind right off the bat. Put me on the spot. I can't think of anything else off the top of my head.
Well, we talked the other day about the Tell Johnson, not to keep coming back to Uncle Tell,
Right.
but I had mentioned in my research that I had heard numerous versions of what he was originally buried with. He was upright at a table with a 6-shooter or a knife or whiskey or cards or all of the above. Depending on who you talk to, the story changes. And you mentioned that your version of it was, I think a Bowie knife and
6-shooter.
And then
Yes.
they move him to Oakwood. And I'm sure the rumors have persisted that he's still there in that same way because it's an above ground crypt. It's a large enough space to use your imagination and think it could fit, but it really couldn't. It's not big enough for something like that.
No. And I honestly, I think he's probably in the ground.
Okay, so that's an
Yeah.
above ground marker, but his casket is below
He's
ground.
in the ground. Yeah.
Okay.
So, that's a lot of things that people come out there and see. They see things that are false crypts that, he must be above ground. No, it's just a false. And so they're actually buried in the ground. Depending upon when he actually passed and when they moved him, they probably didn't want to do too much with him.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
So.
Well, we think about stories that get shared because I've been to Oakwood, never at night, but I've been out there during the day. But I would imagine if it were at night in those oaks and I was in Oakwood, there's a certain ambiance that it would give off if you spent some time there. So I would imagine there are those sorts of stories as well as.
Yes. One of the stories that I've always heard is that Bran haunts the cemetery. And I live on property.
Mm-hmm.
And, I've been in the cemetery business for over 20 years now. And I have never heard anybody tell me a ghost story that didn't start with, we were out drinking one night. So, I cannot confirm anything. But I have been in that cemetery all hours of the day and night, and I have not experienced anything personally. I will say it is extremely creepy. Those trees, they cast shadows. Those headstones, they cast shadows. You catch it out of the corner of your eye, and you can get your blood flowing a little.
I would
quickly.
imagine moonlight playing off some of those surfaces. And,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So you've been out there at times where you've been a little uncomfortable.
Yes, exactly.
Hmm.
I used to walk my dog through the cemetery in the early mornings, and she would stop and always turn around and look behind us. And that's when I quit walking my dog through the cemetery in early mornings.
Hmm.
I will say it's got a reputation for being a place for people to go and jog.
Yes.
You see a ton of joggers run around and through Oakwood. Is that something that is unique in your experience, or is that something that's fairly common?
I have never experienced that in any of my other cemeteries where I've worked, but I do know that one of my good friends runs Glenwood Cemetery in Houston, and it's kind of in a neighborhood, and families go there and walk and jog, and it's a protected area. You're not gonna, it's not like you're walking down LaSalle or any of the busy streets around Baylor. So it's kind of a protected area, and I love the fact that especially the Baylor students, that's their little place to go and to jog, walk, study. I did have to tell one guy one day to take his hammock down. He had it strung between 2 trees, and he was studying for finals. And
Wow.
I said, we want you to to hang out, but not literally hang out.
Yeah. Speaking of finals, Oakwood. Because it raises Eric's question raises a really good, what should the role of a place like Oakwood be in kind of the ongoing life? I mean, you've thought about this some, how should the community interact with it? At what point is it a public space? At what point is it a private kind of space?
It's definitely a public space. During the pandemic, when the pandemic was at its worst, there was all these questions about, well, what do you do with funerals? Do you allow people in? Do you, I can't control what happens, who comes into the cemetery.
Mm-hmm.
I can't stand there with a clicker and go, count cars. It's a public space. I have no clue if you're coming out to see a loved one, if you're coming out to a funeral, or if you're just looking, just wanting to walk around and look around. Living on property, I'm out in my yard or, doing stuff, and there's a constant flow of traffic in that cemetery every day. And on Saturdays and Sundays, it's tremendous, the amount of people that are in and out of that place.
Mm-hmm.
And, the majority of them are there to go see a loved one, we have people that come out on anniversaries of deaths, they'll do balloon release. We've got people, you go out and they've got tents set up with chairs. They're having a picnic. They're having kind of a family reunion. And that's what cemeteries originally were, as a place of celebration. And Oakwood is still like that. And, I enjoy people being out there. And I really enjoy, back to the jogging and people being on property, is that when you've got a widow that's out there that's elderly to go see her husband, there's somebody there. So that if something does happen, that, if she falls or something like that, somebody's there to help them. And that to me is what, and that happens quite a bit. The Baylor students that are out there jogging, walking, studying, they're kind of the centuries of the cemetery.
Yeah, because, tracing this story of Oakwood and Waco, it's not in the boonies anymore.
No.
And so I would think for management, from your standpoint, there's been, particularly in the last 20 years, a lot of increased kind of development pressure
Yes.
around Oakwood. So what has that meant for the cemetery?
There's to the north of us, it's all student housing for Baylor. And to the southern side of us, you're starting to see the neighborhood kind of grow and more people move in. We're trying to acquire more property where we can to help make sure that Oakwood's sustainable for the future. There's not that many cemeteries in Waco, functioning cemeteries. You've got a lot of cemeteries that are out, China Spring, Chalk Bluff, in those areas, they have their own cemetery. But for those that actually live in Waco, there's Oakwood, Rosemound, and Waco Memorial Park. And Doris Miller outside of Belmead.
I don't know enough about the business side of this to know what kind of rising property values, what that does to, your operation or challenges it might present for your operation, and maybe it doesn't. I don't know enough to know.
Cemeteries are, we don't have to pay property taxes.
Okay.
So when we buy property, it goes immediately to the to be declared for cemetery use.
I see.
Yeah.
And that probably lives in a trust or something like that that's
Yes.
managed by the association.
Yeah, we've got a trust. That's what helps keeps us viable.
Yeah, or the same thing that happened to First Street. If you were a taxable entity, it would be getting hard right now, I would think, to maintain
definitely.
that much land.
Definitely. Yeah. And, if Oakwood was to, be full today, then we would become a historic site. And you still have to mow the grass and maintain the trees and maintain the headstones. And so that's where that trust comes in.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting that with an association attached to Oakwood, you have a different setup for that long-term care versus First Street, which is a part of the City of Waco Parks and Rec department.
Right.
And so they do come out and mow and they do regular maintenance, but you don't see the same maybe community investment in it that you would with an Oakwood or a perpetual care cemetery.
Right.
And that's always something that's fascinated me about First Street is, is there a place for us to put together some kind of a friends group, essentially to function along with what the association does and your board of directors for Oakwood? And maybe that's just part of what happened with First Street. It got landlocked, and then it became a city function, and then they thought, well, okay, it's taken care of. But you lose some of that passion maybe for the people who were interred there.
Right. The thing that keeps the cemetery going is, besides active burials, is the people that come out. And, everybody that's in First Street, First Street closed 1878, 77, and there's nobody else around that has a loved one buried out there. and that they're going to actively, physically want to go out there and see. So you don't see that as much. You get the historians, you get the people that are, looking for the generals that are buried out there, or, some of the more prominent individuals. But, that's all that you get out there. You don't get the families coming out.
Mm-hmm.
And so you lose that, and that's when the cemeteries really start to decline.
Is that why the walking tails and the joggers and all that is good, just in that it keeps a community engagement, or keeps a...
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. Walking tails, I wish I could say that, that was Oakwood's idea, but it's the Storytellers Guild. They have taken that and run with it. I bet I answer that question a couple of times a week. When's Walking Tales? When's Walking Tales? And from my understanding, from my recollection, it's the second or third Saturday in October. Used to always fit perfectly right on homecoming weekend. And, for those that don't know what it is, it's the Storytellers Guild comes out and they have people come out and do first-person interpretation of some of the individuals that are already buried there. Sometimes they dress up, sometimes they don't. But it's a lot of fun, and people enjoy it. And this last year was really significant because we were right in the middle of COVID, and it gave people an opportunity to be outside and something to do. And it's just fun to see the people that show up for that and the excitement that they have for it.
You mentioned sustainability in terms of basically square footage and acreage to be able to work with, but what are your thoughts on some of the trends in burials that are the more sustainable options? You see people being buried in ways that they can become, a tree.
Mm-hmm.
Their remains can go to be a part of the ecosystem in that way. Is that something that you ever foresee being possible at Oakwood, or are there state laws that say you can't do this here? What's the status of that?
We do handle green burials. Green burials have not come to Waco in a strong sense as of yet. But if somebody wants to be buried in a wicker basket or something along those lines, we don't have a problem with that. The tree issue we do have a little bit of a problem with, because those tree roots are going to get into the adjoining burial sites, and they're going to shift caskets, shift headstones, or make it more difficult to bury somebody next door. And I love trees. I can't say enough how much I love Oakwood's trees. And, I'd love to have more of them out there, but we have to be careful with how we plant our trees and where we plant our trees, so that we still have room to do our main mission, which is serve the people of Waco. Mm-hmm. But, definitely green burials it's a big thing that's coming through. And that's something that we're kind of looking at for the future, is how do we accommodate people that want green burials? Right now, cremation is on the rise. Being here in Texas, we're in the South, the Deep South, we're a little bit slower to cremation than the rest of the country. I think we're almost 50%, but you've got New York and Northern California and Washington and Oregon, they're 85% cremation. Mm-hmm. We're a little bit slower down here, but it is definitely making, is on the rise. And so we're having to look at ways to serve people that choose to be cremated. We've got a columbarium wall now, and a columbarium is like a mausoleum, but it's only big enough for cremated remains. Last year, I just added 2 new walls to it. But for the future, where do we need to go? And what do we need to do to better serve the population?
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Now, obviously, the trees are the most important botanical or fauna-related aspect that grows in Oakwood, but I've heard a rumor about a certain plot related to a famous Texas musician that may or may not also have some greenery involved with it. This is what we call a segue, and I've made Clint very uncomfortable. But can you tell that story?
There's a gentleman that is buried out at Oakwood who was Willie Nelson's road manager. And I think he was a UT grad. There is a longhorn on the front of the headstone. And I couldn't tell you his name for the life of me, but his nickname is Pootie, P-O-O-D-I-E, I believe. And there have been some things that have been found growing on Pootie's gravesite that we do go out and remove as quickly as we can. I haven't seen it in quite some time, but it has happened in the past.
Okay.
Rumor confirmed.
Now there's going to be a line out there.
Exactly.
One thing I think Oakwood offers kind of a case study, interesting case study of an all-female board. I'm interested, and maybe I wouldn't ask this question if it was an all-male board, but how do you think that's kind of shaped the development of Oakwood as an operation, the fact that women have had this opportunity to speak into its direction for so long?
You know, the women that have served on the board are fiercely loyal to Oakwood. You know, in order to serve on the board, you have to be a property owner or descendant or of a property owner, and this is their cemetery. My family has plots out there. We've been out there for over 100 years. It's my cemetery, and I think that they want to make sure that Oakwood maintains the way that it has, so that it is still the gorgeous place that it is. Back in the old days, in the 1890s, the city had all sorts of stipulations. They had money managers that would help out, but nowadays we don't need it. We've got lawyers, real estate agents, CPAs that have served on the board and helped to guide us. And they've made some tremendous decisions that have helped our endowment, healthy, so that we can move forward and do what's needed to do to make sure that Oakwood is sustainable. Mm. I mean, these ladies are just, they are no shrinking violets. They are strong, smart, business savvy individuals that have taught me a lot, in my 5 years there.
Mm-hmm. Well, I also know you're responsible for Rosemound, which is the cemetery kind of behind Oakwood.
Yes.
Okay. If you could talk a little bit about, we have a death in the 1930s. What determines where I go? I mean, if I might be in Greenwood, or I might be in Rosemound, or I might be in Oakwood, just, what those elements are determining options that are available to families. Yeah.
From my understanding, Rosemound was built to be a low-cost alternative to Oakwood.
Okay.
So I think it comes down to a lot of time is financial.
Mm-hmm.
And Rosemound is still, significantly, it's less than Oakwood. And there's another little cemetery that is attached to Rosemound. It's called Garden of Memories. And it's hidden way back in a little neighborhood. The cemeteries touch. You have to kind of look at a map to see how they join one another. But it's an even smaller cemetery with a smaller price tag to better serve the population. Garden of Memories was actually a cemetery that was designed for African American and Hispanic burials. And that's still a lot of families that go there tend to be more Hispanic because they have loved ones that are already there, mm-hmm. and they just want to be close by. Mm-hmm. But as far as going to Greenwood, Oakwood, Rosemound, I think a lot of it has to do with geographic location. Mm-hmm. If you lived over on the other side of the river, then Greenwood would be where you'd want to go. And Greenwood also was very African American heavy. That was the African American burial ground, and I think that it eventually went into Hispanics as well. Mm-hmm. And then you had the Anglo side of it, so that kind of dictated. And then those that could afford it would go to Oakwood.
Yeah, there was a news item. It's been maybe 10 years ago now when they took down the fence at Greenwood when the city took over the responsibility of Greenwood Cemetery, and they took down the fence between the African American side, or they were two different cemeteries at that point, the African American cemetery and the white cemetery. When is Oakwood kind of integrated, or when are kind of black burials, African American families able to have burials at Oakwood?
I can't say that with any can't say anything without any date or anything
it's hard
like
to pin
that.
Down.
One of my grounds crews that's been there for since 1976 said it was in the 70s. Mm-hmm.
which would fit. I mean, if we think about what's going on at a Waco level with integration, if we're thinking
Right.
about education and other services and things like that, we're talking about the 60s and 70s.
Right.
Yeah. So that's really interesting because, I mean, I know your vision for Oakwood. I mean, the hope was now Oakwood is more representative of the whole community than it's ever been.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Very much so.
One of the memorials that always strikes me, and I'm drawn to it because of the way it looks, but also because of sort of the uniqueness of it, is the Firefighters Memorial.
Yes.
And that's one of the few that I've seen around that actually features paint on the monument itself. And it strikes me as the sort of thing that's a very public monument. And you mentioned, Oakwood being a public place, people coming in out and enjoying Waco's history. Do you happen to know why that memorial was chosen to go in Oakwood as opposed to somewhere like, say, downtown or an area where you would assume more people might see it?
Well, around the Fireman's Memorial are actual burial spaces. And you have firefighters who lost their lives or who've opted to be buried there with their brothers. I think the last burial took place there in the mid-2000s, 2012, something like that. I think he was one of the associate fire chiefs. And that's important to them. And, you have different sections within the cemetery that were purchased by groups or organizations for their members. There's a union group that has burial sites out there. The Methodist Children's Home actually has several different plots or lots for, I don't know if it's just the children that may have passed away that were out there or what.
Mm-hmm.
And even the Confederate section was purchased by the John Cleburne Camp of Confederate Veterans. And so they just bought their areas for their fellow brethren.
Mm-hmm.
So you see a lot of that in different cemeteries, different sections set aside specifically for. And then you have the sections that just kind of pop up, friends and like-minded individuals. I think the one that's really kind of comical that is the Greek Orthodox Church. They've got their own little. They've declared it their own little section, and I think that's great. They're congregants of the same church. They more power to them.
Yeah. I'm always fascinated by some of the fraternal groups that you see. You'll find Masonic headstones. You'll find IOOF. And my favorite, I think, are the Woodmen, the Woodmen of the World groups that are often tree or stump or, wood related in their shape. Do you have a favorite type of stone or marker that you always enjoy?
The Woodmen are always neat. You always get questions. With Historic Waco, we've started doing school kids through the cemetery. And the greatest question is, was he a lumberjack? And then
those famous Waco lumberjacks.
Exactly. That's why, But, the Woodmen always stand out.
Mm-hmm.
The Masons always stand out. They have some pretty impressive designs that they've used. But the Woodmen are always the favorites. And then it's always fun to try to explain what a Woodman of the World was to a third grader.
Yeah, that is difficult.
Yes,
yeah. So I did forget to mention Clint Lynch is president of Historic Waco Foundation. Eric Ames is vice president of the Historic Waco Foundation. And so it's great to hear that school kids are getting opportunities to go out into the cemetery. Yeah.
It's so much fun. I in my early career, I was a historian at the State Cemetery in Austin, and we would run 20,000 school kids a year through the cemetery during what I call the high holy days of Texas history. And and I've loved sharing. Again, we, like I said earlier, this is where you can get all the history of Waco. And, we can't traipse them around the cemetery for 6 hours, which, would give them a decent tour of the cemetery. So we try to hit the first 4 blocks and just talk about, some of the prominent figures that, were the early movers and shakers of Waco. And one of the best ways are the street names. Do you know Parrott Avenue? Do you know Bagby Avenue? Do you know Hubby? Fort Street? These, that was what really resonates a lot with the kids, especially some of the kids. I think the one we went through was Cesar Chavez. So the kids out there, that really, those are the streets that they grow up on.
Mm-hmm.
And that really kind of drives it home that these people were, in order to have a street name after you, you've got to have done something fairly, prominent.
Yeah, some of these kids, it's their first time in a cemetery,
Yes.
probably.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, well, as a society, we're so scared of death anyway, on the whole, and historians sometimes are guilty of dragging our kids into cemeteries instead of amusement parks. I know my kids have been taken.
It's cheaper.
It's
Yeah.
much cheaper, much
Yes,
quieter.
Exactly.
Yeah. But to be able to expose groups of school kids to not only the reality of death and what happens after, but the history all along with it, I think it's a great way to tell those stories and to keep that generation engaged and to keep those stories moving forward. We can tell them all we want, but there really is something tangible about seeing a burial plot of someone who is important to Texas history.
Exactly. When in college, I worked at the Sam Houston Museum in Huntsville, and, to stand in the room where Sam died, it gives it a presence.
Mm-hmm.
But, it's almost kind of the same thing when you're standing at the graveside of William Cameron or, L.S. Ross or somebody like that. This is where he is. This is where he ended up. I think it kind of does make a little bit of a presence and an impression on the kids.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think your background, Clint, the cemetery, working at the state cemetery, working at that site at Sam Houston, and then you mix in a funeral director, kind of that experience. What do you think that added to kind of your job? Because I can connect the other two because those seem a little familiar to me. But how do you think you being kind of a funeral director added into kind of this mix of how you approach what you do?
It gives you a better understanding of what it takes to physically get to the cemetery. When you do the school groups, you're always going to get these questions. Those questions that the teachers kind of just shy away and go, "Oh, please don't answer that." But the kids want to know, and I think that that's helpful. And when I'm working with a family that has had a loss, they need to come in and purchase property. I know what they're going through. I know, okay, we're still dealing with the funeral home. I know what they're doing, and I'm able to, help them, guide them, share my experiences and get them from one point to another.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's really helpful.
The house that you live in, because I ride my bike through the cemetery, and I've seen you walking your dog out. When was that house built? Was it a caretaker's house?
It is a caretaker's house. Okay. It was built. I found the blueprints the other day. It was built in the late 1920s, early 1930s.
Okay.
Yeah, and I did find in one of the Gildersleeve photos, he took a picture of the house. That the house is brick now, but it was clapboard to begin with. So over the years, it's been bricked and established, and they added on to it the old office, which is behind the house. And now we're in our new office, which is built in about 2012.
I would imagine their job responsibilities were more diverse back then with regard to the cemetery than yours are. Yeah,
very much so.
You haven't handled a shovel lately.
No, I have not. Going back, I found one of the early audits of the cemetery. It was from the early 1900s, and it dealt with veterinary bills, horseshoes. What are they, furriers that put, that kind of stuff. And that just made me roar with laughter, because everything's tractors now. And so, yeah, it's definitely changed throughout the years.
And how are the records? I mean, because I know you're interested in historical material and kind of going back and looking at tracking burials and that sort of information. I mean, how have you found those to be? And because I know you've gone back and wanted to look.
Oh yeah, definitely. The one thing that I can say is that our records are in excellent shape. We've gone through and put everything into a database, a searchable database that we can use physically. Now we're in the process of putting it into a mapping software that over time will be added to our website.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're coming out, if you're coming from out of town, you haven't been to Oakwood in 20 years and you're trying to find, great-grandfather's grave, this will be able to help you. And we've got card files where, we've got the owner on one side and all the burials on the back side. And so we've been pretty fortunate that, those records are in pretty decent shape. In the early 1900s, there was a fire. We did lose some records, and we've been able to go through. I'm holding a book here that's kind of a history of Oakwood that also lists all the burials up to a certain point. And we've been able to go through those and find, whoever compiled this book went through the obituaries.
I see.
So we've got those records. We may not know, exactly when that person died or when that person was buried, but we know that that person's there.
I'm curious, when you're meeting with a family who's just suffered a loss and they're in that headspace where if you've been through the death of a family member, it can be a very difficult time to wrap your head around details, and you need a trusted partner to walk you through that process. But have you ever had a person whose family comes along and says, we chose Oakwood because we know it's a historic cemetery and we know that, Grandpa would have wanted to be here? Or does the history of the cemetery ever come up in those conversations? I would assume occasionally.
It does. It does. I have families who come in and they say, well, we have to be in the old section. And I had one lady right after I started, she wanted 12 spaces in the old section. And I said, I'm sorry, you're about 100 years too late. I just don't have that much room in the old section. And I think it is the perception. You're in the old section, the trees are bigger, they're more mature. You've got some of these historical figures around you, and they just don't want to be in the back. And the back is nowhere, it's still beautiful. Doesn't look like the front, but it's just that perception. Yeah, it definitely plays a perspective for some people.
Two things I thought of, related to the same topic, is cemeteries have enthusiasts, people that are just into cemeteries. I mean, you were talking about cataloging. I've used Find a Grave I don't know how many times, and that's a that's a crowdsourced project. And I think of etchings, and so there are these enthusiasts, right? That come and engage in Oakwood. Should we do etchings, or are they bad for the tombstones?
They're not. I mean, if they're not done correctly, you can do some damage to the stone. So we prefer people not to do it, but I'm not on the grounds 24/7. So
when do you take your lunch, just in case I want to do?
I'm not going to answer that question. But, we do get people, and I'm one of those people.
Yeah.
Nobody will travel with me anymore because I love to go through old cemeteries and just, I may not know, I found myself in Louisville, Kentucky, in Cave Hill Cemetery, which is one of the most beautiful cemeteries I've ever seen. And, I was explaining it to friends, and they were just looking at me like, what is wrong with you? But, they're such beautiful places, and if you're into trees and, flora and fauna, there's cemeteries, there's all of that. If you're into architecture, there's headstones. If you're into art, you can find it all in a cemetery. Mm-hmm. And it's just amazing, the monuments of, people leave of themselves.
I'm reminded of a stone in a cemetery in Paris, Texas. It's actually a monument with a figure of, they're not sure if it's supposed to be Christ or an angel or who it is, but it's a figure in a robe holding a cross. And the man who's buried there was a town businessman. He'd made plenty of money. And then when he died, he decided for a fun little send-off that he wanted his statue of this mourner to have cowboy boots. And so we were going to go up that way to go to a state park. And I told my kids, okay, when we go to Paris, we're going to go to this cemetery. And instead of being like, oh, why? They were like, cool, let's check it out. So you're not alone, and there is another generation who are being indoctrinated into this world of cemetery fans. But that made me wonder: is there anything in your knowledge of the stones at Oakwood that has a similar feel? If there's any of those sort of gag or prank or you have to look for it icons on the grounds.
Short of the pockmark on Brand's stone. The one that really comes to mind, it's not really a gag or a prank or anything like that. It's Cornelia Smith's. I call it the Claw. Cornelia was, I think, the first female dean at Baylor. She was dean of biology, and her husband taught in the English department and was a gifted poet and sculptor. And that is their bronze sculpture, and it's one of those pieces that's close to the road, but it's far enough from the road as you drive by. What was that? It catches your eye, and that's what gets most people comment on about the cemetery. But as far as gimmicks, we have a guy who is buried out at Oakwood, who a ledger stone is a flat stone that lays on top of the grave, and the ledger stone is in the shape of a pool table. And back behind it, the stone that stands up straight is a shark with a pool cue. So he was a pool shark. And he has the definition of a hustler on the backside of it. Huh. So that is great. We have a gentleman who was a writer for National Geographic, and his stone is a typewriter. And on the keys are his name and his dates. So, I mean, you've got some stuff like that that really stands out. You have to look for them. But, nothing like, Jesus with cowboy boots. But, the pool shark is something to definitely behold.
That's pretty great. That's a dad level pun, to the extreme. You took it to the extreme of the afterlife.
Yes.
I'm going with this to the grave.
Yes, definitely.
Is there the crowds that'll go out after hearing this? Is there any etiquette that you would suggest? And because I remember, and this is just superstition, not to walk across a grave, to walk around a grave. I was taught that as a kid. So I remember walking through cemeteries thinking, okay, how tall might this guy, I don't want to step on his toes, but just those sorts of things that, some of it folklore, some of it etiquette, some of it superstition.
The not walking across a grave is more of a, respect thing. Mm-hmm. But I mean, if you want to get to certain parts of the cemetery, you're going to have to walk across a grave. And I started telling my school kids this when I was in Austin at the State Cemetery, is that's okay. They're just happy you're here to see them. Our biggest thing about etiquette is not to climb on the headstones. Some of the stones are extremely old. They're extremely delicate. And we just don't want the stones to get damaged or for the stone to fall and, hurt somebody. Mm-hmm. So that's the biggest thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so the association is responsible, I guess, for upkeep and all those. Nothing goes back to the family or anything like that. How does that work?
The headstone, when, you don't actually buy the property, you buy the right to use the property.
I see.
But when you do put up a headstone, that stone does belong to you or to your family. If that stone were to fall over, and if it's your great-great-grandfather's stone, it's covered under your, household insurance, and it can be, replaced, repaired.
Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Eric, you think you're ready to buy in?
I'm getting close. The sales job has been, it's really pushing me that direction. Yeah.
So to get really dark, in 100 years, if we want to come see you, Clint, where will you be?
Not very politely, I shoved my sister out from underneath the tree that's on our family lot. So I will be nestled in my spot in Block 18.
Block 18.
Yes.
Okay.
Membership has its privileges.
That's right. And that was her comment. Well, what gives you the authority to do that? I said, I run the place.
Well, now you got to outlive your sister.
That's true.
Incentive.
Or go first.
That's right. I guess that's true. All right. Well, Eric, any other questions for Clint?
No, this is really fascinating. I've always enjoyed Oakwood. It's one of the first places when we moved to Waco that I wanted to find was where's the historic cemetery, and the first place people pointed me was to Oakwood. And I've been out many times. I've spent many hours either doing research or just sitting and enjoying the surroundings. It's very peaceful. It's sort of like Cameron Park in a way. It's a sort of urban park environment in the middle of the town. That's just really nice to get to. We appreciate you coming in and sharing your expertise and your stories. It's truly fascinating.
It really is. It's an amazing place. I like to call it an oasis amongst chaos, especially sometimes with Baylor across the street.
Yeah.
But it is a place where, with the walkers and the joggers, it's a place you can go, clear your head, spend some time in reverence, and I think that's important. Mm-hmm. And remember.
Yeah, I think it's a landmark. I think it's really important. So I really appreciate you coming on.
Glad to do it.
Let us know a little bit more about it.
Glad to do it. I enjoyed it. Thank y'all for having me.
All right. Good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right on.
Oh, thanks, Mike.
Yeah. There's a voice in our ear. He's saying we did well. Thanks for having me in too, Stephen. I
Oh, that was
enjoyed,
fun.
Sitting in, yeah.
That was fun.
It's hard to be in the presence of a master interviewer because this is
no.
literally what you do.
Well,
I'm thinking,
I would have Clint crying, but this has got to go out for public consumption.
that's what we
not hard.
agreed on,
Yeah.
Stephen. I wanted him to cry.
That's
I
not
did
hard.
ask him where would he be in 100 years, so that was as dark as I got at the end.
Exactly.
No, and we didn't plug Brotherwell. Are we still?
Yeah, so Mike will do that. But yeah, if there had been a way, if there had been a gravestone with a beer can, I would have.
Had you asked,
I
there
would've-
are gravestones with beer
There
cans
are.
engraved on them.
Oh really?
Yes.
See, and he even said that the only time he's ever heard people experience these stories, it's like it started because I was,
Exactly.
several beers
Yeah,
in. That's where we
exactly.
said sponsored by Brotherwell Brewery. So close, so close.
No, it's still on our intro and our outro.
Yes.
Yeah. So
I didn't know if you were doing organic plugs in the middle of
if it happens, yeah.
Cross the Brazos and Waco, ride hard and I'll make it by dawn.
Thanks for listening to the Waco History Podcast. Like what you heard? Subscribe, rate, and review our show on iTunes so we can reach more listeners. You can find show notes and info on every episode at wacohistorypodcast.com and more info on Waco's past at wacohistory.org. Our theme music, used with permission, is Cross the Brazos at Waco, performed by the late Billy Walker. For more info on Billy's music, go to billywalker.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
This has been a Rogue Media podcast.